In the freezing winter of 1610, a Hungarian nobleman named Csejte Castle led his men through the frozen gates of Csejte Castle. They were ready for the cold, but not for the smell that hit them inside, a sick mix of burning wood and something metallic, something very wrong. Deep in the castle's underground rooms, the dark rumors from nearby villages became real. They found a young girl chained up in a cell alive, but her eyes were empty like her mind had already escaped this terrible place. Then they found another girl. Finally, they walked into a room and found where the smell was coming from, a dead young woman lying on a table, her skin white as snow and covered in hundreds of small holes, like every drop of life had been drained out of her. But the person who did this horror wasn't some monster hiding in the shadows. She was found sitting in her dining hall, full of cold, proud nobility. This was Countess Elizabeth, the niece of a king and a member of the famous Bathory family, a family whose dark history in Transylvania was almost as scary as Vlad the Impaler, the real person who inspired the Dracula stories. When they showed her the horrors they found, she didn't feel sorry at all. She was just coldly angry that these men dared to enter her home. This creates a scary mystery. How does a smart, educated woman become the monster people say she was? Before we go on, I want to ask you something. If you think these dark stories and forgotten histories are worth remembering, you can help us keep making these videos by liking and subscribing. Your support helps us keep exploring these mysteries. Tonight, we will open her castle gates. We will follow the story of the Blood Countess through history, from the legends of Transylvania to a lonely castle in Hungary, from the trial that shocked the kingdom to the vampire stories we still see in movies and books today. 2/18. This isn't just the story of a monster. It's the story of total power, our own pride, our own darkness, the dragon inside the queen. To understand that dragon, we must first see the golden cage that created her. Before she was the Blood Countess, she was a genius child, a lonely queen trapped in a prison made of her own power. To solve the mystery of what she became, we must first travel back in time to meet the brilliant, scary girl she was. Welcome to the Midnight Narration. To understand the woman who would become the monster, you must first understand the name she was born with. That name was Bathory. In 1500s Hungary, that name wasn't just a name, it was a promise and a threat. It meant power. The Bathory family was one of the oldest and most powerful families in the whole kingdom. They weren't just rich merchants had gold, but the Bathorys had land. Huge areas of land that went on for miles, covered in dark forests, wide rivers, and hundreds of villages full of people who lived and died under their control. They built giant stone castles that showed their strength, and they led armies into battle. For hundreds of years, the Bathory name meant victory and fear. They were the princes of a wild, beautiful land called Transylvania, a place of old mountains and deep shadows, a place of legends. The people who lived there whispered. 3/18. That the Bathory family was different from other rich families. They said the family had wolf blood. This meant they were proud, fierce, and sometimes there was a wildness inside them, a dangerous spark that couldn't be controlled. The family was known for two sides. On one side, they were brilliant, smart, brave, and born to lead. But on the other side, there was darkness, a history of terrible anger, strange moods, and a cruelty that seemed to run through their blood like poison. This was the family that made heroes, and this was the family that made tyrants. Elizabeth's own uncle was the greatest example of the family's power. His name was Stephen Bathory, and he wasn't just a prince or a lord. He was the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, one of the most respected and powerful rulers in all of Europe. This was the family Elizabeth was born into. She wasn't just another noble girl. She was a Bathory, the niece of a king. From the moment she was born, the world expected her to be great, powerful, and brilliant, and it wouldn't be disappointed. But the world didn't know about the family's other side. It didn't know about the darkness that came with the wolf blood, and in Elizabeth, that darkness would find its perfect home. Elizabeth grew up in a world made of silk and stone. From her earliest days, it was clear she wasn't like other children. She was a prodigy, a real genius. 4/18. At a time when many powerful noblemen could barely write their own names, young Elizabeth was learning to master languages. She became fluent in 4: Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. Her mind was sharp and brilliant. She was raised in pure luxury. She had dresses made of the finest fabrics, jewels that sparkled in the candlelight, and servants who brought her anything she wanted. She lived inside a beautiful golden painting. But a painting, no matter how beautiful, can also be a prison. Her childhood wasn't filled with warmth or simple games. It was a time of training. She wasn't just a girl, she was a political piece, a valuable object that belonged to the great Bathory family. Her lessons weren't just about reading and writing, they were about power. She learned how to command servants, how to speak to powerful men, and how to hide her true feelings behind a face of cold, noble pride. She was surrounded by people every single day, but she was deeply, terribly alone. And there was something else that separated her even more from the world. From a young age, Elizabeth suffered from a mysterious illness. Without warning, her body would be taken over by violent seizures. She would fall to the ground, her body shaking, her mind lost in a storm. In the superstitious world of the 1500s, people had a dark explanation for this. They whispered that the girl wasn't just sick, they whispered that a demon had taken hold of her, a darkness living inside her perfect, noble body. 5/18. But perhaps it wasn't the work of a demon. Perhaps it was something even sadder. Perhaps her mind was simply too bright, too powerful for a young girl's body. A mind that felt everything so intensely that sometimes it would simply break under the pressure. These fits were the first cracks in the beautiful golden cage she lived in, a sign that inside the perfect princess, there was a deep and troubled world that no one could see, a world that would one day burst out and drown everything in darkness. In the world of the powerful, a daughter's marriage is one of the most valuable things a family has. It's not given for love. It's a piece in a big political game, a way to join two powerful families together to create an alliance so strong that no one can stand against it. For a girl as important as Elizabeth Báthory, her marriage was decided almost as soon as she could walk. When she was just 10 years old, a child playing in the cold halls of her family's castle, she was promised. The man she was promised to was named Ferenc Nádasdy. He was the son of another one of Hungary's most powerful families. By joining the Bathorys and the Nádasdys, this marriage would create a force that could shape the future of the entire kingdom. At age 15, the deal was complete. Elizabeth became his wife. But Ferenc Nádasdy wasn't a simple husband. He was a living legend, known across the land as the Black Knight of Hungary. He wasn't a prince who sat in a comfortable chair. He was a soldier, and the battlefield was his true home. His entire life was dedicated to one brutal purpose, fighting the armies of the powerful Ottoman Empire, who were constantly trying to invade the kingdom from the south. 6/18. He was Hungary's shield, and he was terrifyingly good at his job. He was a brilliant commander, but he was also known for his extreme cruelty. In war, he was merciless, showed his enemies no pity, and his victories were always soaked in blood. But in the violent world of the 1500s, this wasn't seen as wrong. His cruelty on the battlefield was seen as strength. He was respected, celebrated, a national hero. This was the man Elizabeth married, a man whose life was violence, a man whose greatness was measured by how many enemies he had killed. He was a celebrated hero, and he was almost never home. Right after their grand wedding, a celebration of power more than love, the Black Knight returned to where he belonged, the battlefield. He left his young, brilliant wife behind to wait for him in his vast, empty castle. He had given her his name, his wealth, and his power, but he had also given her his absence. And so the Black Knight went to war. He was gone not for weeks or months, but for years at a time. While he was away fighting the great armies of the South, his teenage wife was left in charge of everything. And Elizabeth didn't just wait, she ruled. She was the absolute master of the Nádasdy family's vast lands. She was the boss of thousands of people. She was in charge of the farms that fed them, the villages they lived. 7/18. in and the strong stone castles that protected them. She collected the taxes, paid the soldiers, and made sure there was enough food for everyone. The people who worked for her learned quickly that their new lady wasn't a weak little girl. She was intelligent, efficient, and very, very strict. She demanded perfect obedience, and she wasn't afraid to punish those who failed her. During the day, the castle was her kingdom, a busy world of noise and activity. Servants, soldiers, and officials would line up, waiting for her decisions. She was a queen on her throne, and her power was real. But at night, the noise would fade. The servants would go to bed, the fires would burn low, and the castle would become quiet. In the long, dark hours, her kingdom became her prison. She would walk the vast, empty halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had power over thousands, but she had no one to talk to. She had wealth beyond imagination, but she had no friends. She was the lonely queen of a silent castle. The only connection she had to her husband, the only proof he was still alive, would arrive by horse. A tired messenger would bring a letter from the distant battlefield. But these weren't love letters. They weren't filled with soft words or loving thoughts. They were reports from the war, written on paper that smelled of smoke and steel. Sometimes they were even stained with mud and blood. They told stories of battles won, enemies killed, and the brutal business of war. This was what she learned in those long, lonely years. 8/18. She learned that power was a tool to keep order. She learned that fear was the best way to make people obey. And she learned that in her cold, empty world, the only thing she could truly rely on was her own strength and her own will. She was learning to be a ruler, and she was learning to be alone. The lands that Elizabeth controlled were huge. The villages were far apart, separated by thick forests and winding roads. News traveled slowly. In this isolated world, Elizabeth knew that her power was the only thing holding it all together. Her husband was a ghost, a name whispered by soldiers. She was the one who was real, the one they saw every day, and she believed that their respect for her was the only wall standing between order and chaos. One day, a servant girl was caught stealing. It was a small thing, a piece of bread perhaps, or a silver button from a dress. The girl was young and probably hungry or foolish. In another home, she might have been scolded or had her pay taken away. But this wasn't another home. This was the kingdom of Elizabeth Báthory. And Elizabeth didn't see a hungry girl. She saw a crack in the wall. From her perspective, the theft wasn't about the stolen object. It was a challenge, a test of her authority. If one servant could break the rules and not be punished, then another would try, and then another. Soon the whispers would start in the villages. They would say the countess was soft, that her husband was gone, and the woman who ruled in his place was weak. 9/18. And weakness was a disease, a sickness that could spread through her lands like a plague. She knew she had to cut it out before it could grow. So she decided to make an example of the girl. She had her brought to the center of the castle courtyard for all the other servants to see. She ordered her guards to punish the girl, not in a quick or quiet way, but in a slow, public, and brutal way. The other servants were forced to watch. They saw the girl's tears, they heard her cries, and they understood the message Elizabeth was sending. It was a message written in pain. I am the one who makes the rules here. There is no one above me, and this is what happens when you forget. This act of cold, calculated cruelty was a turning point. It wasn't yet the work of a monster who killed for pleasure. It was the work of a lonely queen who believed that fear and respect were the same thing. She was speaking the only language she had ever truly learned, from her family and from her famous husband. It was the language of absolute power and necessary pain. It was a lesson she was learning to speak very, very well, and it was a lesson she would soon begin to enjoy. Then in the year 1604, news arrived at the castle. But this wasn't another letter smelling of smoke and steel. It was the final message from the battlefield. 10/18. Ferenc Nadesti, the great Black Knight of Hungary, the hero who had survived countless battles, was dead. He wasn't killed by an enemy's sword, but by a sudden illness that took him in his war camp. And with his death, everything changed. The one man whose power was equal to her own was gone. The one person in the world who could perhaps have controlled her was gone. Elizabeth Báthory was now a widow, but she wasn't a sad, weak figure in black. She inherited her husband's great wealth and his many castles, adding them to the vast power of her own family. She became, in an instant, wealthier and more powerful than she had ever been before. She was no longer the lonely queen of the castle, waiting for news from a distant husband. She was the absolute, unquestioned master of her own world. For all those years, her husband's life had been like a chain, however long, that kept her connected to the world of men, war, and politics. Now that chain was broken. And a dragon, finally freed from its chain, is a hungry creature. The question was, what would it feast on? In the first months after her husband's death, Elizabeth did what was expected of her. She wore black, lived in quiet mourning, and grieved. The loss was real. Ferenc Nadezhdy had been more of a shadow than a husband, but he was the great defining shadow of her life. He was her partner in power, and his death left a hole in her world. 11/18